Hi everybody, my name's Audrey Morshan and I am the CTS intern in the church supplies at CPH, and I'm filling in today for Peter because he's unavailable. But today I'm going to be talking with Reverend Daniel Ross, who's the pastor at Christ Lutheran Church in Topeka, Kansas, and we're going to be discussing his blog post about internal audience segmentation. So thanks for being with us today, Pastor Ross. How are you doing? Good, good. So let's just jump in and get started. So your blog post is about internal audience segmentation, and it was. It seems like there are a lot of people who put a lot of time and effort into communications going outside of their organization, but they don't always put as much time and effort into internal communications. Do you have an idea about why that would be?
I think it's there's just a lot of assumption on internal communication, especially with um, by and large, most of internal communication is within kind of a small group, and people don't think about when it goes beyond that small group about the barriers that there might be within communication. In fact, there's actually not a ton written on it outside of when like don't use acronyms, things like that with external, whereas internal you can. There's not a lot about just the differences between audiences and why there's differences between audiences and the barriers that there might be on internal audiences.
Okay, so how common do you think it is for internal communication issues to occur in the church or even just in any organization?
I think it's actually really common. One of the biggest, if not the number one frustration that I come across when talking with people is almost entirely internal audience communication. Just, why doesn't this person respond to my email? I called that person last week and they still haven't called back. Um, that all goes back to internal communication. Again, this is within the group, not the external communication. So I think it's very common, and I think it's common because a lot of people don't think through or process through some of the issues.
Okay, so your first step in audience segmentation was defining your audience. So why is it important to define your internal audience?
This is kind of one of those I think obvious things once you think about it. When you're communicating with a certain group of people, you want to communicate with those people. So if you want to communicate with your education board, you don't need to email the whole council, right? If you want to communicate with the church secretary and the pastor, you don't need to email the elders, right? So defining your audience, figuring out who it is that you want to talk to, and on a certain issue is kind of a lot of it's uh, subconscious, so to speak, of just this is who I'm going to talk to. But it does still sometimes help to process through that because when you define those audiences, then you can start looking about who makes up these audiences, who are the individuals on the audiences, which then gets into later about communication forms on them.
Okay, can you give the audience some tips on how to define their own internal audiences?
I think probably the easiest one is to kind of look at your formal structure. So most churches have a council. You have your individual boards. You might have people that are heavily involved, important uh, laity. Some people call them power brokers, things like that. You have your church staff. So you could just look at it like a church organizational chart if you want, and easily sit there and say, okay, here's our official um, internal audiences right here. Um, Beyond that, you can have, if you work with certain groups of people on, so you have your youth volunteers that, these 5 people are always wanting to volunteer with youth. Okay, they might not be on the board, they just volunteer at youth events. So um, figuring out who those groups are, first start off with kind of the official structure and then add into it those individuals that are involved maybe in different areas.
Okay. Can you give us an example of some groups that you've segmented, like maybe your church body into?
Yeah, it's real simple. I have email groups for a church council. I have an email group for the elders. I have email groups for trustees. So the different boards, um, it is kind of how I have it structured for my internal audiences. I also have um, kind of a mental list of people to talk with when we talk about maybe doing a minor tweak. So one thing is that we're going through at my congregation is we have communion cards that people fill out every time we have communion, and it's somewhat of a hassle to print them off, to cut them up, to make sure they're always in stock. So one of the things that we talked about among the elders was, what if we just had a laminated card in there? We directed everybody to, read through this, but it wouldn't have to constantly be restocked. But before we went forward with the idea, there was a couple of the ladies in the congregation, a couple of the other members in the congregation just thought, let's get some feedback on this first. And so, since they were older, just had one-on-one conversations with them over the course of a couple weeks. But that's kind of some of the groups that I have, just me personally. I don't.
Right, right. So now, right. So now, your second step that you talk about in your blog post is figuring out the preferred communication. So can you talk about the importance of reaching out to different people in different ways?
Yeah, this is normally where the breakdown happens with internal communication. Um, Most people already kind of know the groups that they have, but they don't think through who makes up the different groups. And so in the blog post, I made up a hypothetical council had 14 members because when I first came up with it, it had 13 members. And I'm not superstitious, but I didn't want to stay on 13 members. And when you think about maybe who's on your typical council, you probably have some retirees, some working parents who have um, maybe parents with young children, people that are just working and they're on the go. My screen has frozen, by the way. Is the audio still running?
Oh, it just cut out. Oh, sorry, we're having technical difficulties right now, but we'll hopefully we'll be able to get Pastor Ross back up and running here in a little bit. Okay, so it looks like he's back. Okay, sorry about that. All right. I think we are in the middle of talking about reaching out to people in different ways.
Who makes up the individual groups? In office staff, there's usually, you've trained them on the ways of communication. They usually check their emails or their phones throughout the day. But when you think of a church is a servant kind of organization. In other words, you have a lot of people voluntarily serving. And so you might have retirees that don't check their emails outside of once a week or once every couple of weeks. You might have um, millennials that don't want to talk on the phone but send them a text message. You might have older people that they don't want text messages call them on the phone. And so there's not just one best way of communicating with them, but how do you communicate consistently with them? A lot of people are going to pick email, but if you send out an email, how are you going to get everybody to reply in a timely way? And that's when you want to kind of go through your list, and you might speak specifically with people saying, hey, what is the best way to communicate with you? And then if it's not obviously email, because it's not going to be email for everybody, send that phone call, send a text message and say, hey, look, I sent an email out to the whole group. If you could look at it within the next day or so and put feedback on it, give us some feedback on it, your thoughts on whatever the issue is. But being proactive and not just assuming that everybody's at their computer waiting for that email to come through is going to mitigate so many communication issues that I've had them in my ministry. I've heard other people express them. And so it's better to be proactive. It's going to take more effort, but good communication always takes effort. It's just the way it is.
Okay. So in your blog, you listed several communication tools that could be useful for people. Some of them were like email, in-person conversations, phone calls, GroupMe, etc. Can you talk us through some of the pros and cons of a few of those?
A GroupMe or a Slack or something like that. That's you can have teams as big as you want, but that's usually more people that are involved in the day-to-day stuff. So you're probably looking at your staff there. So to have necessarily for your council to get everybody to get the app either on their phone or their computer, it's going to be a really big hassle. In-person communication or interpersonal communication through the phone it's the best way to communicate, but it's time consuming and it's limited. So how do you communicate with a whole group of people? And especially if you want the information to be consistent, usually you're looking at, if you're not in the meeting, an email, but retirees might not have emails. I have a member that does not have a computer, and if they were ever on council, they would never get email because of it. So figuring out these some ways are better than others when it comes to either individuals or groups, and you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons with that, and realizing that usually a mass communication, you're going to have some personal follow-up with that, with certain individuals within the audience, within the internal audience, because they have lives. They're not doing whatever your church is 24/7. They're being grandparents. They're being parents. They're being students, and so just being aware of those limitations that people have on time and trying to accommodate them as much as you can is gonna reduce stress.
Okay, so in your blog post, you outlined a few steps about what good internal audience segmentation looks like. Can you walk us through those?
So you want it to include the people that it needs to be that need to be included. So defining your audience. Am I talking to the council? Am I talking to a certain board? Am I talking to the school board? Am I talking to the staff? Listing those individuals, putting them in groups. And if you're an organizational person that likes to see, write it down on a chart, and then go through and on the individuals that you have for those groups, right next to it, what is their preferred communication style? Do they want a phone call? Do they, if you send an email, do you need to send a text maybe a couple hours later and say, hey, just a heads up, you've probably already seen it, but I sent you an email. When you have some time, could you read it? Or if the email is urgent, could you reply to it ASAP. Um, and some of that's going to be demographic. So millennials, they don't like to talk in person. They've spent so much time communicating electronically that face to face and phone conversations, they, as a generation, do not like phone conversations. Um, it's directly tied to the interpersonal skills. Interpersonal skills are lower than other generations. Now, as they get older, I'm a millennial. I'm better at phone conversations now. I'm not scared of them anymore. I don't hate them anymore. So that's things to learn. Older members aren't gonna like the impersonalness. I can't think of the word of a text message. They're going to want a phone call more than likely, or a face-to-face conversation. Now, the other thing is, some of those you can't always accommodate, having to have a face-to-face conversation with 5 people. So what's a backup to that is kind of the next thing. So it's really kind of cross-referencing the group you want to speak to and how to speak to them.
Okay. So then your last step you talk about on the blog post is following up. Can you talk about how important having follow-up discussions with people is?
I think it's really important. Even if you have a face-to-face conversation, a lot of people still feel the urge for email. So you might just send an email saying, "Hey, following up on the conversation, this is what we talked about." Follow-up's important because it's getting feedback to a conversation. So if you sent an email or you had a phone conversation, knowing that it's kind of like active listening, only in a much longer timeline. You're saying, "This is what I heard," or "This is what I think we discussed," right? And making sure everybody's on the same page. My screen has frozen again. Are we? Am I still? Can you hear me?
We can still hear you, and we still have visual for now. Oh, there it goes. So now it cut out. Okay, so sorry, bear with us again. We have a little bit more technical difficulties. Hopefully, Pastor Ross will be back up soon.
Hi.
Oh, it looks like he's coming back. Here we go.
Okay, I don't know what's going on.
Oh, yeah, well, hopefully it'll last till the end of our talk here.
Yeah.
So we can just jump into the next question if that's okay with you.
That is fine.
Awesome. So it seems like internal audience segmentation is a lot of steps. It's kind of some extra work. What do you think makes it worth it?
Less frustration in your life, more prompt replies to conversations, especially on urgent matters. Better communication as a whole, as a group. Those 3 things right there. I mean, if you want to have less frustration in your life, communicate better. How do you communicate better? Here's some ways to do it.
All right, awesome. So our last question is, do you have any advice for anyone who's looking to figure out the best way to communicate with their own church or organization?
I mean, for an internal audience type of way, just talk with people about what is a preferred method of communication, and realizing that you're going to have so many different options that you're going to have to kind of narrow them down, and you might not be able to accommodate everybody's number 1, but hopefully number 2 or number 3 on their list. You can talk to them that way. And be clear about your defined audience. If you're talking about something within your board, you don't need to spam the whole council. The whole council doesn't need to necessarily know the internal conversation of the youth board or the fellowship board or the evangelism board as they figure out maybe something that they want to do. That's not a council conversation. So Um, define your audience, communicate as best as you can in the preferred method, or alert them to a communication, maybe not in their preferred method, but through give them the alert through a preferred method.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Pastor Ross, for taking the time to talk to us today and for writing your awesome blog post. It was really informative. So next week, we're going to be talking about keeping in touch with college students when they head back off to school. So thanks to everyone who viewed our live stream today, and we'll see you again next week at 11:30.